This is a true story, and every time I share it, it leaves the room silent. I've never posted it before, but after revisiting it with a friend recently, I felt it was time to put it into words. In the summer of 2020, my friends Alex, Violet, and I were desperate to escape the monotony of COVID lockdowns. The cabin fever had hit hard, so we planned a mountain getaway, a mix of camping, hiking, and adventure. As part of our trip, we decided to rent a secluded cabin for one night, something near a fire tower that Violet's parents had raved about from their own travels. While we couldn't get an actual fire tower, we found a cabin right next to one. Cheap, clean, and isolated. It sounded perfect for a night of unwinding and being as loud and carefree as we wanted. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we had the idea to make the cabin night extra memorable by dropping acid. Violet had even brought a whole sheet of it, ready for the adventure. But as we pulled out of the driveway for the cabin, I was hit with an intense, gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong. "I can't do it," I said. "We can't trip tonight." Violet was furious. We argued all the way back to the house, tension mounting, but I stood my ground. The feeling was too strong to ignore. Finally, after what felt like forever, Violet relented, and we continued the drive in uneasy silence. The cabin was about 30 minutes from the nearest town, perched high on a mountain accessible only by a narrow, winding road. The drive up was nerve-wracking. No pull-offs, no campsites, just dense woods and the steep ascent toward the peak. When we finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as advertised, remote and eerily quiet. We started a fire to keep warm, trying to settle in. As dusk turned into night, the quiet grew heavier. Then we heard it, the distant rumble of an engine and the beam of headlights slicing through the trees. A side-by-side pulled up, carrying 3 teenagers. They waved, climbed the fire tower, and left without much fuss. It was a relief. We'd read that visitors occasionally came to see the fire tower, but we hadn't known what to expect. Once they were gone, we doused the fire and moved inside. We made a quick dinner, lukewarm hot dogs, and sat in silence. That's when we realized how unsettling true silence can be. In the middle of nowhere, the absence of sound is deafening. Every rustle of leaves, every breath of wind feels magnified. Back in the city, there's always some hum of traffic or the buzz of appliances to fill the void. Here, it was just us and the creeping noise of the woods. We jumped at every little sound, too nervous to talk. Eventually, I had enough. I cracked open some wine coolers, passed them around, and slapped a board game on the table between our bunk beds. Slowly, the tension lifted. Laughter filled the cabin as we joked and played, finally enjoying the night we had envisioned. But in the background, there were noises. The snap of a twig, the faint rumble of an engine. We all heard it, but ignored it, unwilling to break the fragile calm we'd created. Then it happened. A human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it. 3 times. The sound shattered the night. We screamed in unison, our laughter instantly replaced with terror. Alex fumbled for his phone, dialed 911, and put the dispatcher on speaker. He shoved the phone into my shaking hands and grabbed fireplace pokers, handing them out like weapons. Violet, in tears, started calling her family to say goodbye. I held the phone and tried to focus on the dispatcher's voice, my heart pounding in my ears. Whoever was out there had heard us call for help. They knew we weren't alone. The silence outside grew suffocating. Whoever it was, they were now moving carefully, retreating quietly. The dispatcher assured us that help was on the way, but the 20 minutes it took for law enforcement to arrive felt like hours. When they finally pulled up with dogs in tow, we were trembling, but grateful. The officers swept the mountain, combing the area with flashlights and trained noses. But they found nothing. The officers suggested it might have been a bear, but even as they said it, their expressions betrayed their doubts. A bear? That didn't make sense. We'd barely cooked those hot dogs. There wasn't enough food sent to attract wildlife. And why would a bear slap the window by 3 screaming adults instead of going for the pan we'd used to cook? Bears don't knock like humans. And when had a bear ever made a stealthy retreat at the sound of people shouting? The officers had no real answers, but they did have one chilling observation. On their way up the mountain, they'd passed a car parked at the base of the road. It was the only sign of life they'd encountered during the drive. I remember feeling my blood run cold at that revelation, though Alex and Violet were too frazzled to fully process it. Their attention was fixed on something else, a new horror. Violet's car, which had been thoroughly coated in dust from our drive up the mountain, was now covered in handprints. Prints that didn't match ours. Prints that touched places none of us had touched. In a frenzy, we grabbed our things, shoving them into bags and throwing them into the car. Every instinct told us to leave, to erase ourselves from that mountain as fast as possible. The officers led the way, and every pothole in the road felt like a step closer to safety. We made it down in record time and found refuge in a seedy motel that reeked of cat urine. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safe, and that was enough. Even so, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to that car on the road. There had been no other vehicles, no other campsites, and no other pull-offs. Just the narrow, winding road to the top and the fire tower at the peak. Whoever had been in that car had stopped further down the road and hiked the rest of the way. They didn't want to be seen. They didn't want to leave tracks. They wanted silence, secrecy. Whoever had knocked on that window wasn't there for a cheap scare. This had been planned. To this day, I don't know what the person on the mountain wanted. Maybe it was meant to be a sick prank, or maybe it was the start of something far worse. I'll always be grateful for Alex's quick thinking and calling 911. I wonder if our visitor had expected us to have cell service. Maybe that was the unexpected twist that disrupted their plans, enough to make them leave before things got worse. And truthfully, I don't think I want to know what they had in mind. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I was 11 when this happened. My older sister, Ariel, was 14, and my younger sister, Belle, was 8. At the time, my dad worked as a freelance programmer. He earned great money from his projects, but because he was buried in over $500,000 of debt, and my mom wasn't exactly gifted at budgeting, our family rarely had extra money for luxuries. Vacations were a rare treat, and when they happened, they were usually trips to visit relatives. One evening, my dad had just finished a big project for a major client. To celebrate, we gathered in the living room for a movie night. My dad had picked Final Destination. He loved horror movies and took an almost mischievous joy in scaring the daylights out of us. Halfway through the movie, the phone rang. Dad got up to answer it and came back a few minutes later to grab my mom. The two of them left the room, and we kept watching, though Belle quickly paused the movie to pull our dog, Duchess, into her lap for comfort. She hated scary movies, but loved being included. When my parents returned about 10 minutes later, they had an announcement. We were going to spend the weekend at a cabin. At first, We didn't know what to make of it. It was so unexpected. Dad explained that his client owned a lakeside cabin in the mountains and had offered it to us for the weekend at a heavily reduced price. It was Thursday, so my mom immediately launched into a whirlwind of packing. The rest of the movie was forgotten as she bustled around the house, getting everything ready. The next day, after school, we loaded up the family van and headed to the mountains. The drive took about 2.5 hours, and by the time we arrived, it was late. The cabin sat on a secluded plot by the lake, surrounded by tall, dark trees that swayed in the night wind. The air was crisp and cold as we stepped out of the van, our breath visible in the glow of the headlights. Once inside, we explored. The cabin was a cozy ranch-style layout with plenty of character. There was a small nook about head height, probably meant for storage, but it was perfect for the three of us to climb into and play games. A few dozen board games were already up there, so we wasted no time picking one to play. We also picked out rooms. Mom and Dad got the largest one. Ariel claimed a smaller room with a twin bed. That left Belle and me with a room that had a queen-sized bed we'd have to share. It wasn't bad, except for a couple of odd details. There was a window on the right side of the bed with no curtain, leaving it exposed to the outside. On the left was a bedside lamp, the only light source in the room. Opposite the bed was a closet with a locked door that we couldn't open. We were curious about the closet, but we quickly moved on to our games and didn't think much more about it. By the time we went to bed, it was around 11. Belle was a restless sleeper and prone to kicking, so I took the spot closest to the lamp to avoid her accidentally knocking it over. I remember lying down and falling asleep almost instantly. The next thing I knew, Belle was gripping my arm tightly, trying to burrow under me. Her small, frightened voice squeaked something unintelligible, and it took me a moment to process what was happening. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw something. Pale, human-shaped, and unmistakably moving away from the window. My sleepy brain struggled to comprehend it, but when it clicked, I shot out of bed, dragging Belle with me. We ran straight to our parents' room, panic spilling out of us as we explained what we'd seen, but they didn't believe us. Mom brushed it off, saying we must have been imagining things. "Go back to bed," she said gently. "If you see anything else, let us know." Annoyingly, I believed her. I convinced myself it had been nothing, and Belle and I returned to our room. This time, Belle refused to sleep near the window, so we switched spots. I told her a story to calm her down until she fell asleep. Exhausted, I soon followed. When I woke up the next morning, the events of the night before lingered in my mind, but the daylight made it all feel distant, almost like a bad dream. The next day, we spent the morning exploring the lake. The air was crisp, and the water glinted under the soft sunlight. After about an hour, Dad suggested we drive into the nearby town to spend the day. It was quaint, filled with small shops, and my parents took their time wandering through every single one. We had lunch at a cozy diner, lingered for dinner, and finally headed back to the cabin, just as the sky started to darken. As we neared the cabin, Ariel cracked a joke about something trivial, and we all laughed, until Dad suddenly held up his hand, signaling us to stop. His demeanor shifted in an instant, the relaxed ease replaced with sharp focus. He stepped toward the cabin and lightly pushed the door with his finger. It swung open without resistance. The latch wasn't engaged. "Dad?" Ariel whispered, moving closer to Belle and me. Dad shook his head quickly, warning her to stay silent. Without a word, he stepped inside, disappearing into the dark cabin. We stood frozen on the porch, the air around us heavy with unease. A minute passed, then 2. Finally, Mom broke the silence, calling out his name. Dad's voice came back, calm but firm. "It's okay. You can come in." We stepped inside cautiously, finding him standing in the middle of the living room, his face tense. He locked the door behind us and exchanged a look with Mom before leading her into the bedroom for a private conversation. Ariel, ever perceptive, caught on to the tension immediately. To distract Belle and me, she suggested we play another round of the board game from the night before. Her voice was a little too bright, her movements a little too quick, but we went along with it. We hadn't even finished setting up the game when Mom and Dad returned. Mom busied herself with the dishes from breakfast, her motions deliberate, while Dad joined our game, trying to mask his unease. We played for a few hours before Dad announced it was time for bed. It was only 9, a much earlier bedtime than usual. Ariel protested, her voice sharp with irritation, but Dad didn't budge. Belle and I headed to bed while Ariel stayed behind, arguing with him in the living room. Back in our room, we climbed into the same spots as the night before. Belle by the window, me by the lamp. I read to her softly, trying to keep both of us calm, until we eventually fell asleep. I woke to the sound of Dad rushing into our room. His face was pale, his movements urgent, as he scooped Belle out of bed and grabbed my hand. "Come on," he said, his voice low but firm. He pulled us into the hallway, where I saw Mom doing the same with Ariel. That's when I heard it, a high-pitched whine coming from the living room. Duchess was sitting at full attention by the back door, her fur bristling and her body rigid with tension. Her growl was low and guttural, barely audible under the strange whining noise. Dad didn't put Belle down and didn't let go of my hand as he led us to the van. Once we were all inside, he dashed back to the cabin to grab Duchess. She leapt into the van without hesitation, still bristling, and Dad didn't waste a second tearing down the narrow road. He didn't say a word the entire drive home, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Duchess didn't settle until we were halfway down the mountain. The tension lingered in the air long after we got home. Ariel found out the details the next day, but Belle and I weren't told the full story until years later. That night, Dad had woken up to a faint moaning sound outside his bedroom window. At first, he thought it might have been the wind, but something about it felt wrong. He got up to check and discovered the front door unlocked, though he distinctly remembered locking it before bed. In the kitchen, small items had been moved, things they hadn't touched since the night before. As he looked around, Duchess began growling at the back door, her ears pinned back and her body tense. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. That was the final straw. He locked the door, grabbed us, and got us out of the house as quickly as he could. The next day, Dad went back to the cabin to collect our luggage. While there, he made a chilling discovery. Several pairs of footprints in the dirt outside Belle's and my bedroom window. It was late November in Colorado, and I was about 7 or 8 years old. My dad had decided we should take a weekend trip to a rented cabin, an idea my mom thought was perfect for some family bonding time. My sister, who was 11 at the time, and I were excited, even if we weren't entirely sure what to expect. We packed up on Friday, taking a day off school to get an early start. I wasn't going to complain about that. After a long drive, we arrived at the cabin. It was bitterly cold. Winter was clearly on its way, but the snow-covered mountains around us were beautiful. We spent the evening settling in, deciding where everyone would sleep, and making plans for the next day. It was late by the time we arrived, so there wasn't much to do that first night. After dinner, we all got ready for bed, but as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I heard faint noises outside, like footsteps crunching in the snow. Curious, I peeked out the window but saw nothing. Shrugging it off as an animal passing by, I tried to fall asleep. 15 minutes later, the sound came again, this time louder and closer. I nudged my sister awake, and she groggily listened. When she heard it too, we both tiptoed to the window. This time, we caught a glimpse of something. A pale figure moving through the trees. We couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was definitely human-shaped. Fear prickled at the edges of my mind. We decided it was better not to be seen, so we climbed back into bed, trying to pretend it was nothing. Neither of us slept well that night. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of breakfast. My mom was in the kitchen cooking, and my dad was outside. Still shaken from the previous night, I asked my mom if I could go outside to join him. She agreed, and I left my sister inside. As I stepped out, I saw my dad talking to a man I didn't recognize. He was short and stocky, with a shaved head and a veteran's cap. What struck me immediately was how nervous he seemed. Despite the freezing weather, he was sweating profusely and kept fidgeting. My dad noticed me and waved me over. "This is my son," he said, introducing me. "What's your name, kid?" the man asked, flashing a tight smile. "I'm Name," I replied, offering a polite smile in return. Then, in the blunt way kids sometimes do, I asked, "Are you okay? You look scared." He chuckled awkwardly, coughing a little before answering. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just shell shock, you know. I'm a veteran," he explained, gesturing to his cap. Something about his tone felt off, but I didn't press further. The man introduced himself as Patrick and explained that he was renting a cabin nearby with his family. My dad seemed to take a liking to him, and Patrick ended up joining us for breakfast. He seemed normal enough, even friendly, as we all sat down together. Afterward, my dad suggested we go outside to play. While we were out there, I tripped and scraped my knee. It wasn't a bad injury, but as any young kid would, I started crying. My dad was inside at the time, having been called in by my mom. Unfortunately, that left me alone with Patrick. He rushed over, kneeling beside me. Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice soothing. "Come to my cabin. I've got some Band-Aids." Through tears, I nodded. I was too young to question whether this was a good idea. I followed him as we walked deeper into the woods. At first, we talked about ordinary things, video games, my favorite snacks. But then his questions turned strange. "What shoe size are you?" he asked out of nowhere. I shrugged. "I don't know." He chuckled, his smile stretching unnervingly wide. "How old are you?" "7, I said hesitantly. "Good to know," he replied, his tone making my stomach churn. We walked farther than I'd expected. His cabin wasn't nearby, as he'd claimed. It took at least 20 minutes to get there. When we finally arrived, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The cabin was dark and silent. There were no signs of a family, no other cars, no lights, no voices. My heart started pounding. "Where's your family?" I asked, my voice trembling. Patrick didn't answer. Instead, he locked the door behind us. I didn't want to go along with Patrick, but I was lost, and I didn't think I could find my way back to my cabin alone. The door was locked anyway, so I reluctantly agreed to eat with him, hoping to get it over with quickly. That's when things started to get even stranger. As we sat, he asked me casually, "How much do you weigh?" I wasn't sure, so I guessed. Around 73 pounds. His expression shifted. A wide, unsettling smile spread across his face. "Perfect weight," he muttered. "Perfect weight for what?" I asked, my stomach twisting. He just kept smiling, not answering. I was unnerved and asked if I could leave, but his demeanor turned darker, his voice unnervingly cheerful as he said, "Oh no, we're just getting started. You wouldn't want to miss out on the fun." His tone sent a chill down my spine. Before I could say anything else, a loud bang came from a closed door in the back of the cabin. Patrick's face twisted with anger, and he stood up abruptly, muttering to himself as he stormed toward the door. I froze as I heard him yelling behind the door. "Did I tell you to move? No! Stay the fuck where you are! I have company!" When he came back out, his face had returned to that unsettling smile. "Sorry about that," he said smoothly. "That was my wife. She's very sick and can't be around visitors." Something was deeply wrong. I looked around the room, noticing how messy it was. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and it seemed like he had been living there alone for a long time. Then, the door opened, and a pale woman stepped out. "I'm hungry," she said softly. Patrick's face contorted with rage. "Get back in there!" he shouted. She glanced at me briefly before retreating into the room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked exhausted, broken. I tried to keep calm and asked, "Where are your kids?" Patrick didn't answer. Instead, he changed the subject. "I've got some kids' clothes you should try on," he said, his tone unnervingly casual. That was it. I knew I had to get out of there, but I didn't know how. Tears welled up in my eyes, and Patrick came closer, pulling me into an awkward hug. "It's okay, little one," he said, his voice dripping with false reassurance. "Nothing's going to happen. Just try on the clothes." He went into the back room, giving me a moment alone. That was my chance. I quietly unlocked the door and slipped outside, careful not to make any noise. I didn't care if I got lost. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I moved through the woods, I could hear shouting from the cabin. Patrick's voice carried through the trees. "Where the fuck did he go?" he roared, followed by muffled yelling. I couldn't make out. Then, I heard him shouting again, this time directed outside. "Hey, kid, it's okay. You can come back now. You don't have to try on the clothes." His voice was sickly sweet, but I could hear the anger beneath it. Panicked, I ran. My heart pounded as I sprinted through the forest, branches snagging my clothes as I tried to find my way back to my cabin. I didn't look back, though I thought I could hear footsteps and more shouting in the distance. After what felt like forever, probably close to an hour, I spotted it. My cabin. Relief flooded me as I saw my dad outside, frantically looking around. I ran straight to him, tears streaming down my face, and told him everything. "Patrick isn't a good guy," I sobbed. "He was really weird, and he touched my leg." My dad's face darkened. He immediately called the man who rented us the cabin. That's when we found out something chilling. No one had rented the cabin Patrick claimed to be staying in. My dad didn't waste a second. He told us to pack up, and we left that day, cutting our trip short. The cabin owner apologized profusely and refunded us for the next night. He also contacted the police, who went to investigate the cabin. The police told us later that Patrick and his wife were gone, but their belongings were still there. Clothes, random items, and other signs of someone living there had been left behind, but no people. They asked us a few questions, but after that, we never heard from them again. To this day, I don't know who Patrick really was, or if that was even his real name. He lied about having kids, so what else was he hiding? Was the pale woman really his wife, or another victim? And why had he been living in a cabin he didn't even rent? I'm just thankful I got away. I'll never forget that terrifying weekend, and I hope I never see Patrick again.